This is William and Lonsdale, and welcome to part 2 of our conversation with the Honourable Michael Kirby, AC CMG. If you've not listened to part 1, I highly recommend you catch up on that before diving into part 2. In this episode, we'll hear about Michael's appointment to the New South Wales Supreme Court as President of the Court of Appeal, his ascension to the High Court of Australia, and his extensive work with the United Nations on issues such as human rights violations in Cambodia and North Korea and the AIDS epidemic.
Michael, after a brief stint on the Federal Court, this is subsequent to the Law Reform Commission, you were appointed to the Supreme Court of New South Wales as President of the Court of Appeal. My observation of courts of appeal, which mainly here in Victoria, is that it is principally criminal work, criminal appeals. And if that's correct, was that a learning curve for you to move into the area of crime? Criminal appeals?
I did do work in what we called the Court of Criminal Appeal, which was constituted by the Chief Justice. He had the power to constitute a court from judges of the Supreme Court, and I was, in addition to being President of the Court of Appeal, I was a Justice of the Supreme Court of New South Wales. The then Chief Justice, a very fine man, Sir Lawrence Street, didn't send the invitations, and I was actually serving in the Court of Civil Appeal. The Court of Appeal in New South Wales was a court that was dealing with contract law and human rights type issues and the whole gamut of procedural fairness in civil courts in New South Wales. And that was my experience. When I was President of the Court of Appeal in New South Wales, I think it was one of the best times for that court. It had a really brilliant group of judges. They were all men, and nobody at the time questioned about the composition of the court, but they were divided. It was, a 5-4 division between what one might call the legal conservatives and the legal radicals, or the legal open-mindedness, I prefer to say. That was a very...
Can I ask, who had the 5 and who had the 4?
I would say that generally the Liberals had the majority, but it's an interesting phenomenon in a court that it observes a hierarchical phenomenon. If the presiding judge is Conservative or is Liberal, that tends to trickle down and influence the others. And he or she now has the power to constitute the court, and therefore that can influence the outcome of cases. I always tried to constitute the Court of Appeal in New South Wales with a mixture of people who were expert in an area and people who were more likely to question it because they weren't expert in the area, but were very, very good lawyers. I think it was a glory days time in the Court of Appeal of New South Wales, which was none of my doing. This was the result of appointments earlier, and it was a very happy time. It had been a really nasty court to appear before, as had the High Court at that time. We're talking about the Barwick Court and the Court of Appeal of New South Wales, the Moffat Court, was a really horrible time, and a lot of barristers who appeared before it fainted just with the pressure of the interrogation. They were super bright people, but they didn't have people skills, and I made it my business to change that overnight. And people in New South Wales still refer to the rule of politeness that I introduced, which is basically a professionalism, that you don't add to the stress of the case, the stress of the way you go about questioning and the way you're dismissive of other people, especially women barristers. They got a very hard time in those days, but it became a pleasant place to work. I would have a morning tea every Friday. They'd all come, we'd all sit around the table. I served very good coffee, almost Melbourne-style coffee, and they would go away to their chambers armed with raisin toast slathered with butter, and they would be quite happy in the service. And they had to account for the delays in getting their decisions out. So it was a very good time, and they still talk to this day about the change that was brought about to kindness, politeness, but professional firmness. I'd been brought up in a family of loving people, and I was not going to sit up there and just throw my weight around. You can be very sharp to people if they get behind in their decisions, and you can take them off assignments in order to bring them up to date, but you don't have to add personal animus, and that has remained the case in the Court of Appeal of New South Wales, and increasingly I think it's become the case of the High Court of Australia too. You don't have to be nasty to barristers and solicitors appearing before you. They're already got enough pressure and stress in their lives, and you don't work well if you're under that sort of pressure. Your mind is racing ahead and your heart is pounding, and I've been through all that, and I didn't want to be a cause of that, and so it changed.
Michael, in going through your career to date and looking towards your appointment to the High Court, am I right in saying that you've done little or no trial work as a judge?
Yes, you are right. I did some trial work in the Arbitration Commission before I was whisked away to the Law Reform Commission, but I was the victim of my career and the journey that it took. I did oodles of trial work when I was a barrister. My whole life was trial work, and my whole life was orality. In those days, you had to get on your feet, and in the Workers' Compensation Commission, I had 8, 7, 6 cases a day, and I had to argue those cases and try to win them, because most of my clients were ordinary workers who didn't have a lot of money, and it was very important for them to win, and I strove to win, and I had a very good record. And when I went to the Court of Appeal, I was sitting in appeal, but I had a lot of experience of a different kind. My journey had been of a different kind, but not a lesser kind. I'd had the journey through academic world and then through law reform, where I was considering the boundaries of law, the fact that the law was not always fair and not always just, the fact that it needed pushing the envelope in order to improve its operation, that this was an internal auditing system for the law. And so my experience wasn't the normal experience, but I would contest that it was a legitimate preparation, and especially for an appellate court which is supervising the application of the law and sometimes filling the gaps in the legal system under the High Court of Australia.
So you are appointed to the High Court in 1996. Again, appellate work. You must enjoy appellate work. And I don't think everyone's cut out for appellate work, are they?
No. Appellate work is a bit like being a student having to do exams every day. Every day you are doing your latest test, and you may not be so skilled in a particular area, but you get very skilled, and I became very skilled in appeals, and I think that was actually the happiest time in my legal career. When I arrived, there were a lot of suspicions of me, especially...
Sorry, is this the High Court or the Supreme Court of New South Wales?
Supreme Court of New South Wales, the
yeah.
Court of Appeal.
Yep.
There were suspicions of me because I hadn't come up the golden path, and especially amongst barristers there were suspicions. But I worked my guts out. I was always, or generally, the first whose decisions were in. I worked 7 days a week. I encouraged my colleagues to work, and I encouraged them to be a bit more open-minded and to consider other elements in the legal jigsaw. And therefore, I think that was a success. It certainly was a great honour and privilege for me to sit as President of the Court of Appeal of New South Wales, the busiest appellate court in Australia. At that time, the view was held, which had been expressed by Sir Anthony Mason as Chief Justice of Australia, that our courts of appeal in Australia are contingently final appellate courts, because if they don't contingently get a special leave to appeal, they don't have a look in. And they do tend to be excluded from some areas because the High Court justices aren't particularly interested in those areas of the law, but courts of appeal are the workhorses. And I was in the workhorse, I was in the central seat. When I left, there was weeping and crying of the bar in the Banco court. This is terrible, we've lost the president, and it was packed to the rafters. And I think I was a success there, and my colleagues in the hierarchical rule came to like me and to respect me, and that was a very important thing for judges. You've got to be respected and liked by the profession and by your colleagues, and I think that came about in the Court of Appeal. It was a great court and still is a great court, but because it was 5-4, it was orthodox, but under Sir Anthony Mason's dictum, it was potentially the final court, and therefore it took on the role of developing. Justice Dyson Hayden in the High Court attacked Sir Anthony Mason's principle. He said, even if something has been hinted at in the High Court, it must be followed by the appeal court. Not a binding rule of the appeal court, but even if it's been suggested in obiter dicta. Now, I never agreed with that because that's just not how it works. It was a special time, special people, special opportunities, but I think it led to a very great court. And if you look at the US Supreme Court, when they have a 5-4 division, that tends to be the time when they are at their most creative, because the secret of a really successful appellate court is you are orthodox. You can't go off there sitting under the palm tree and resolving things out of the blue, but you work for constant renewal in the law reform, and that was something I'd basically learned from the time I spent in the Law Reform Commission.
William and Lonsdale is brought to you by Greenslist, one of the leading multidisciplinary barristers lists in Australia. Greenslist believe in promoting conversation around the ideas and issues that shape not only our legal system, but our wider community.
In 1996, you were appointed to the High Court. As a boy from Concord in the west of Sydney, 4th Street High School, what did it feel like getting a call, I'm assuming from the Attorney-General, to be offered a position on the highest court in the land?
Well, I wouldn't be truthful if I said that this came as an enormous surprise. I had been offered and mentioned in dispatches, but I'd never been called. Michael McHugh, who was my junior in the Court of Appeal of New South Wales, got the call and he went off, and Gummo got the call and he went off, and I thought, oh, well, always the bridesmaid, never the bride. You just got to reconcile yourself to the fact that you have a position as President of the Court of Appeal, which is not a bad job to have in the legal hierarchy of Australia. 4th Street, actually, apart from Sydney Grammar School, has delivered more High Court justices than any other school. They have been great schools, and they deliver judges like Evatt, who are more prone to be creative, and that was my fate. So I didn't collapse. I thought my time had passed. But when the Attorney-General of the day, Mr. Lavarch, rang up and offered it to me, I didn't again say, oh no, you need somebody older and wiser, because by that stage I was older and wiser. So I went up to the High Court and I got the best chambers in the High Court. These are the chambers facing Old Parliament House and the Brindabellas. The wood in each judge's chambers is different. Mine was Tasmanian birch. It was yellow. And I knew from my economic studies that if you want to increase the sales in a supermarket, you paint it yellow. Yellow is a happy paint, a colour. And so I was in a happy chambers. I had wonderful staff, a few good colleagues, and the world was opening up to a different judicial path.
Who was the Chief Justice at the time?
It was Chief Justice Brennan, Sir Gerard Brennan, who had sat with me as my junior in the Law Reform Commission. He had served for, I think, 6 years with Gareth Evans and with other judges in the Law Reform Commission, and it wasn't helped in the first week because the Sydney Morning Herald, and maybe the Age at the time, carried an editorial, The Kirby Court. And that was not a good career move for somebody who was coming at the very bottom of the list to what he thought and was the Brennan Court. And Brennan was a very great judge, and he wrote the Mabo, the principal reasons in the Mabo decision, but he had to get on with me and I had to get on with him. We had our differences, but I certainly respected him, and especially his stance. He had, if I can say so, the very typical value system of the Roman Catholic Church, of which he was a leading member. He was very good on issues of Indigenous affairs. He was very good on workers' rights and on the rights of the poor and others, and even some people who got caught up in the criminal system. He was not very good on issues of women's rights and women's participation in the law, and on the issues of homosexuals. And he did not want to hear about my sexuality. That only really changed when my old law school chum, Murray Gleeson, became the second Chief Justice that I served with. And he wasn't all that good on homosexuality either, but he was a younger man and more understanding of the way the tide was flowing.
So on the High Court, of course, you gathered the nickname of the Great Dissenter. Was there a consistent thread in your dissents? Was there a philosophical underpinning to your outlook on the law in general, and therefore it flows through into your judgments?
I think it could be said that because of my period in the Law Reform Commission, I was more open to creativity, because I believe that was one of the strengths of the legal tradition we inherited from Britain.
The common law system.
The common law system is a judge-influenced system, and Sir Anthony Mason, once in an interview when he was attacked for being too creative or activist, he turned to the books behind him, the legal books of the cases going back to 1300, and said, where do you think it all came from? It came from judges. It came from experienced human beings who had to solve a new problem, and they solved it with the values and knowledge of those times. But these are not the same times, and therefore we have to, as judges, without running amok, we've got to improve the law in its application to ordinary folks and decide whether the issue requires re-examination of the basic principles in the case or in the law of that matter. So that was Sir Anthony's view, and I follow it, and I really admire. I think he was a truly great, probably the greatest. I hate to say this in Melbourne, where everybody thinks Dixon was the most marvellous, and he was a very great judge, and these chambers where we're meeting is named for him. But on the whole, he was much more orthodox, and he was a very great technician. But if I look back on those years when I was on the High Court from 96 to 2009, he was read, especially if Justice Hayne was sitting, because everybody knew Justice Hayne worshipped Sir Owen Dixon, but he wasn't read as much as the most recent judges. And Sir Anthony Mason was read, and with Justice Dean all the time. But that is probably just a general feature. You have your day in the sun, you influence those who knew you, you may be up to date in your thinking, or you may be revealed as somebody who was really a bit out of touch. That's just how the English legal system operates. And I think it's why it's in operation in most of the countries of the old British Empire. They've stuck on with the judge-made law, and they still dress up in the fancy dress that we dress up in, and it's one of the greatest legacies with the English language and English sports that the British left behind, and uncorrupted judges. That's definitely one of the greatest legacies.
Can I ask you about uncorrupted judges? Because it appears to me, as someone who's worked his life in the legal system, that our system is admirably apolitical. As far as but I've never been a barrister, always a solicitor or a clerk of a list. But when you look at the US, you see their Supreme Court, you see their state courts and their federal courts appear to be quite political and affected by the political views of the judges. Am I naive in thinking that our system is apolitical? And if so, why? I mean, why have we been so lucky?
I think it's a bit of a naive position. It's the position that is taught in law schools and advocated by legal associations. And if you're talking about political in the sense of party political, then I think what you have said is right. I think judges generally butt out of party political divisions. But if you're thinking of political in the sense of the conservative liberal spectrum, then it's naive, because judges appointed by different parties will tend to have either the sort of democratic liberal attitude that is embraced by the reform program of a party like the ALP, or the more conservative keep the steady running, the economy and housing and so on. These are the important things, and judges are not involved in anything like that. So what you're saying, and what is often said by the legal profession, is a little bit naive, and sometimes deliberately so, because of the understanding that if you told it as it truly is, then that might upset people. But judges in the 20th century began to tell it as it is. Lord Reid said complete apoliticism, in the sense of liberal conservative, is a fairy story, and nobody believes fairy stories anymore. Well, a lot of people in Australia do believe fairy stories, and they like to cling on to them. But, I wouldn't have gone through 4 decades of appellate judging without knowing that there are inclinations. And my inclinations were liberal, in the sense of small L liberal, and looking after and knowing the issues of ordinary folks, poorer people, whereas most of the justices have come from the bar. The statistics still show that the bar is made up of very large proportions of private school and religious school education, and that's why having people who've had a broader education is very important, because values matter. How you decide a case, which is at the cusp, is determined by your values, and values matter. Therefore, in a way, the highest courts, like the Court of Appeal and the High Court of Australia, is a sort of retrospective mirror image of the political movements in society that deliver either Labor governments or coalition governments, or the great move for Greens in politics or of women in politics. These things are reflected a decade later in the type of people who are appointed. Far from that being alien to our Constitution, if you think of it systemically, it's exactly how our constitution is expected to work in a democratic society. That it's not, people are not appointed just because they'll be Labor in their outlook, and that sort of politicism doesn't exist. It doesn't exist with me. But the spectrum of conservatism and caution, and the spectrum of people who are more creative is definitely there, and I think should be there. And in a sense, by appointments by governments is reflective of the great movements that are going on in our society to be more concerned about the environment, to be more concerned about Indigenous people. And you can't stereotype judges. Look at Brennan writing the Mabo decision and Mason joining in that decision. Most of the justices have been educated in private and religious schools. When I was on the High Court, I was the only justice for most of my service who had been educated wholly in public schools. And that is an unusual thing and something that calls for consideration, given that Australians, 67% of Australians, go to public schools. And it's values in, values out.
Michael, I wonder when you ever found time to sleep, because apart from your very busy life as a judge across a period of, 40-odd years, culminating on the High Court, you've also held many international positions. A Commissioner of the World Health Organization, Special Representative of the UN Secretary-General to Cambodia, President of the Court of Appeal of the Solomon Islands, President of the International Commission of Jurists, Chair of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in North Korea, and others. I'd just like to cherry-pick some of those because there's too much to go through all of it and have you tell us about them, really. A lot of the work, I believe, concerned AIDS, especially work you're doing with the UN, was to do with the AIDS epidemic. Why was that work necessary and what, if anything, did it achieve?
Well, I was appointed to the Global Commission on AIDS, and it came about in a curious way by the visit to Australia of somebody who was the Director General of WHO. But, and I think it came about because those who advised the Director General knew that I was gay. And in the early days of the AIDS epidemic, the target of the epidemic was fundamentally in Western countries gay men. And therefore, they thought I might be able to bring values and colour and knowledge to the solutions, which just an ordinary scientist or doctor who'd not been exposed to the epidemic at first hand couldn't do. By the time I was appointed, I'd lost 12 quite close friends, men and women, but mostly young male gay people. And therefore I'd seen AIDS close up, very close up. And I didn't, of course, like what I was seeing, and I didn't like the suffering. But it was a double whammy. You not only had to pretend about your sexuality, but you were at risk, a very high risk. It depended a bit on how you had sex, as to whether you got the virus or you didn't, and whether you had a stable relationship. I, from 1969, had a stable relationship with my partner, Johan. We had therefore seen a lot of people who suffered. And I was appointed to the Global Commission, and at a very early meeting of that commission, we formulated the AIDS paradox, which was that paradoxically the best way to tackle this epidemic without a vaccine and without treatment was to reach out to the people who are most at risk and to try to tell them about this very dangerous virus and how they could avoid it. And so that's what we did. New Zealand led. We followed the New Zealand strategy. Under the Hawke government, Dr. Blewett formulated the policies on the AIDS paradox, and so did the coalition shadow minister, Peter Boehm. So we got there first. The UK followed, even under the Thatcher government, and in that way, by the paradox, And the operation of the paradox, we kept our figures much lower than the United States, where they were all in denial and didn't want to talk about it. This was the double whammy. They're gay and they're also infected. And it was a very, very bad time, a very stressful time for people who were gay. So that's how it came about. I was appointed and I remained in the area of AIDS and various other international bodies because it was a sort of unique position to have this person from far away in that strange country, Australia, who, whisper, was actually gay, but who had some encounter with the global perspective of the epidemic. And in a way, it was a code language for me to tell Australia and the world that I was gay. I didn't sort of stand there and shove it in their face. My partner, Jan, became an Ankali, which was an organisation in Sydney who would go out and help people who were living with AIDS. And often they didn't have any friends. Everybody fled, and it was a really bad time for these lovely young men who got infected. And Jan painted their houses, cleaned their toilets, and talked with them. This was often all they wanted, somebody to talk with them. So his involvement spurred my involvement. Mine was at a higher, more theoretical but important level, and that was just how we came to it. You could not be involved with people who were dying, who were your friends, who'd come to your home and had dinner parties and so on, and not be terribly distressed by what was happening and determined to do what you could. And I think the fact that I was involved was a sort of code language. Okay, you can whisper as much as you like, and yes, he is gay, but he's doing something quite useful in this, and he's doing it on a global scale, and his partner's doing it too, and that's a good, honourable and ethical thing to do.
Lives in the Law is proudly sponsored by City Maps Illustrated. Their recent publication, The Melbourne Map, is a celebration of our wonderful city. This stunning, hand-drawn illustration, which took more than 3 years to create, is available as an art print, jigsaw puzzle and calendar. The perfect acquisition for your home, office or corporate gifting.
What about the work you did in Cambodia? The Secretary-General of the United Nations appointed you Special Representative for Human Rights in Cambodia. I mean, what was the role? So how do these things play out? I mean, were you on a plane back and forward the UN headquarters are in New York, so were you on a plane to the States? Were you plane up to Cambodia? How did you work with your colleagues I assume you had a board or a committee or whatever you were working with?
Yes, well, it's true. There was a lot of travel and a lot of work, but it all had to be fitted into my basic judicial job. And so I had to work doubly hard to get my judicial opinions out, to be around for the regular meetings, and I would go to Geneva and back in the matter of days. That was just how it had to be. But I was fired up by the importance of the work, and Cambodia actually arose in a way that was unusual and unpredictable. The peace treaty for Cambodia after the defeat of the Khmer Rouge, a barbarous regime, was largely negotiated by Gareth Evans. He did it as the Foreign Minister of Australia, and he helped to reach the Paris Agreement, which provided for a special representative of the Secretary-General to assist the Cambodian government on making sure that as they emerged into a democratic society, they would have the best possible advice and support as to how they did that. And so they asked Keba Mbai, who was a friend and acquaintance of mine and a commissioner of the International Commission of Jurists, to take the job. And he said, well, I'm a big man and I would be coming from Senegal and I will only do it if I can travel travel first class because Cambodia's a long way away. And they said, I'm sorry, but the only person who travels first class in the United Nations is the Secretary-General, and therefore we can't do that. And he said, well, thank you very much, I won't do it. And so Gareth, then remembering me from law reform days, got in touch with me and said, would you allow me to put forward your name? Which he did, and I was appointed. It was not a very pleasant job because in Cambodia the Prime Minister became Hun Sen. He was still the Prime Minister until only a few weeks ago, and he was a very dictatorial person, and he appointed his son as his successor. And that is still the situation in Cambodia. But they made some progress, and they made economic progress. And when people have a full belly and they've got increased employment and so on, human rights abuses are to some extent reduced. And this is what's happened in Cambodia. I think they found me a pest. Ultimately, Hun Sen wouldn't talk to me. We had to fly the Deputy Secretary-General of the United Nations out to Cambodia with other leaders of the UN human rights to try and persuade, just conversation. Hun Sen agreed, but then reneged. It was not an easy task. But Cambodia, it's not the worst case. I mean, North Korea is the worst case, but Cambodia had some pretty horrible times, and it was quite a stressful job, but an important one, I think.
And North Korea was another job which the UN appointed you to be you chaired the Commission into Human Rights in North Korea. With no cooperation from North Korea, how did you do the job? I mean, how did you do the job, and could it really have any impact or effect upon life in North Korea?
That's a very important question, and basically I did so by persuading my two colleagues. The Commission of Inquiry was three. Marzuki Darusman, who had been Attorney General of Indonesia, a Dutch legal system, a civil law system, or Sonja Beserko, who was a civil society leader in Serbia, a German civil law French system. These were two people from the background of the civilian system. That's the alternative to the common law system, which is very cheap, very much more Volkswagen, if you like, but it lacks the openness of our system, the insistence on keeping the doors of courts open, never permitting a court officer to close it. I had to reprimand court officers gently of trying to close the door of the Court of Appeal because there was a noise outside. I would say, leave the doors open, the doors of the Court of Appeal are always open. So we conducted the inquiry in a unique way for the United Nations, the Anglo-American way. We had public hearings, we had witnesses, we had people who'd suffered, we recorded it, we put it online, we encapsulated what they said. Our report on every page or every second page had quotes from witnesses, and they were much better at expressing what they'd gone through than I would have been. This was a sensation in the United Nations because most of the lawyers appointed to these jobs are civilians. The UN itself is substantially affected by the 1945 civilian system, which they adopted and have ever since. But the net result of it was we produced a powerful report, but as you say, it doesn't improve the situation in North Korea. At the moment that I'm speaking to you, this is the 10th anniversary of the report. The report gained the support of the Human Rights Council, which had established us. It was sent by them to the General Assembly, and it got a huge vote in the General Assembly. And as we had recommended, the report was sent to the Security Council, which never gets involved in human rights issues. But it was put on the agenda, and it's still on the agenda of the Security Council. And so at least every December, they come back to looking at this and rendering North Korea accountable before the highest organ of the United Nations. Interestingly, a number of the people who came as witnesses said, we know you couldn't solve our problem. We know that your recommendation that the matter be referred to the International Criminal Court is just not going to happen, at least now, because of the veto of China and the Russian Federation. But we had the chance to speak truth to power, and that is something you gave us. And that was a very, very important gift, and it gave courage to a new generation of human rights activists, people who flee North Korea, who flee into China and then somehow get out of China and can turn up in South Korea, as 30,000 people have. This is the hope of the future, and we set up an office which continues our work in Seoul. And I've just come back from Seoul, involved in 3 conferences, actually, on North Korea, and we'll be going back in a few weeks' time to a 4th conference. Some of them are AVL, but most of them are in person. We've got very intelligent people racking their brains as to what the hell we can do about this, because since we delivered our report, North Korea has become extremely active in the nuclear weapons business and also in the intercontinental ballistic missile business, which renders the United States and us subject to their dangerous weapons. It's a very dangerous moment, especially with meetings between Mr. Putin and Kim Jong-un. So you might say, well, you haven't achieved peace and human rights, but we've done what we can within what we've got. And that's something you learn as a lawyer. You're not going to win every case. In many cases, you don't deserve to win. But you've got to do the best by demonstrating in a public way the rights and wrongs of the matter that is in your care. And I believe that's what we've done. And I hope we will find a way to convert the current horrible and dangerous situation into action and improvement.
Michael, we could continue, or I could continue this fascinating discussion all day, but we need to draw to a conclusion. Sitting back now after a lifetime in the law in a variety of ways, is there anything particular which a philosophy that has guided you, something that you might pass on to upcoming younger lawyers to help them on their journey?
Well, my philosophy was basically instilled by my parents and my family, my core family. It was that of love and deep friendship with you, those who are closest to you, and keeping that going, and then to find love. And fortunately for me, I did that at the age of 29. Jan and I met at a hotel. It was one of the very few gay hotels in 1969, and we met there. He'd come out from the Netherlands. Both of us were afraid that we were going to be left on the shelf. Anyway, I was not only in my birth family, but in my adoptive family of Jan's family, and especially Jan, I was sustained by love. I never hesitate to mention it. Anglo-Saxons, you know, find it very fine, straight and gay, to get their magic lips around the word love. And I tell people, tell your mother and tell your father you love them. And because how often do we do that? And it's just something awkward for us in our culture.
Michael, it's been wonderful to sit here and talk to you today. Thank you very much for coming and telling us about your life in the law.
Show notes from today's episode can be found at greenslist.com.au/podcast. There you'll find links to things we've talked about in this episode, a transcript of the show, and some wonderful photos of our guests. If you're enjoying Lives in the Law, please tell your networks, subscribe, rate and review the show. Your host is former lawyer and Greens List clerk Michael Green. Our show is produced and edited by me, Catherine Green, mixed and mastered by Windmill Audio, and recorded by Alex McFarlane, who also wrote and performed all the music for the series. We're coming to you from the iconic Owen Dixon Chambers on the corner of William and Lonsdale Streets in our beautiful city of Melbourne. We acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of this land and pay our respect to their elders past and present. There is no doubt that conversations about justice have been taking place on this land for thousands of years, And we are privileged to continue that discussion here today.